All right, are you guys ready to begin? Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody. We're super excited to be kicking off yet another Student Success Summit. Granted, this is our first virtual one. I'm Heather McChesney, and I'm pleased to get to introduce three of my fantastic friends, all of which I have had the pleasure of working with in some capacity as well. These are the Vaden Labs and Studio ladies that I like. That's what I like to call them for fun. This is Jess, Kelsey, and Brianna. They're going to talk to us a lot today about design thinking and how we can utilize this in our classrooms and on our campus, and how we use this to solve problems and engage the community and engage our students when it comes to thinking processes and solutions. So with that said, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to the ladies. And at the end, we'll open it up for some Q&A. So please utilize the chat box to ask questions, and it's all you all. Thanks, ladies.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having us. My name's Jess, and I'm the founder and principal of Vaden Labs. And to give you guys a little bit of background on us, we're a woman-led design firm based in West Virginia, and our entire team is actually made up of women, not necessarily on purpose, but just it just worked out that way. So I'll start off by giving you just a little bit of context for how our company fits into the sort of social change space. So we are a design firm, but not strictly in the traditional sense. So while we do help organizations with things like storytelling or branding or visual identities, we're also really focused on using design principles to create systemic change. And it's a discipline that's sometimes referred to as social design. So trying to change human behavior and really create a sort of environment or a space that leads people the direction that we want to solve social problems. And if we think about how that works, we can think about how design really has sort of three primary functions, right? So we're trying to communicate information, we are trying to nudge action, and we're trying to facilitate or enhance an experience. So in other words, when we design things, we're really doing so with a purpose, or we're looking for a particular outcome. Kelsey, can you move to the next slide? So to use a super simplified example, maybe we want somebody to push a button on a website or an app. And that might not seem like a big deal, but anytime we're trying to influence any sort of human behavior, there's a lot of thought that goes into that. So everything from the color to the placement to any sort of interactivity to the information hierarchy. There's just a lot of sort of sophisticated design psychology behind what we think of as really simple things. Next slide. And so we're thinking, like at our company, in our lab, that if design is really about communication and experience, then it can be used to tackle what we call wicked problems and drive really meaningful change within our communities. So the term wicked problems might sound like I'm just using some like Boston slang here, but it's actually sort of a technical term or a research term, and it was first used by design theorist Riddle and Weber. And they identified sort of 10 characteristics that when combined make a problem sort of wicked. And there's a link on the slide if you want to dig into this, but in short, wicked problems are problems that don't really have a single cause nor a single solution. They're usually tangled up with other problems and really hard to define. They can't be solved without risking doing potential harm as well. And they tend to have a lot of overlap with other disciplines. So for example, generational poverty is a wicked problem, right? What causes that? We don't really know. How do we solve that? We don't really know. There are a lot of different factors and a lot of different issues involved. Addressing the long-term effects of the opioid epidemic would be a wicked problem. Or helping underserved students go on to college and succeed in higher education. These are all sort of problems that our firm has worked to address, and things that don't necessarily have a clear solution. And we think design is a really good framework to help focus on these things because it gives us a lot of flexibility and a lot of creativity to try to bring to the table. So before we move any farther, I would love for you guys, if you have it at hand, to just grab a piece of paper and a pencil, because we are going to work through some of the concepts around design thinking today. And we're going to ask you all to jot down some thoughts about some problems that you all are trying to address in your own communities or school systems. Kelsey, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So we're going to talk a lot about design thinking today, but it's important to understand that that's just one framework that's within the bigger discipline of what's called human-centered design. And what do we mean by human-centered design, right? So first, it means that we're putting the people that we're solving for, so like our constituents, our customers, our students, our audience, really first in the process. And second, it means that we're designing for how humans really think and act and decide versus how they maybe should. So here are some examples. And Kelsey, if you'll go to the next slide. So we might think that it's like, obvious to put our audience first and our students first or whomever. But weirdly, it's less common than we might think, right? So a lot of times organizations sort of unconsciously or subconsciously end up designing their products or their services around their internal structures and processes rather than the experiences of the people they're trying to work with. So a really common example would be looking at a college, a typical college campus, right? So if we worked with students before trying to help them go on to higher education, a lot of us have probably seen the frustration of students and families who, and particularly first generation students and families who are trying to navigate this sort of bureaucracy that we sort of take for granted in higher education. So students might not understand that the office that processes their application, like the admissions office, are not the same people who handle their financial aid awards, or that housing is completely separate from those folks, and that their academic advisors are even further removed. They just want somebody who knows at the college their name and their situation and takes care of them. And so they just think of college, whereas we're thinking of, that's the admissions office, that's the financial aid office. And so when we design around our sort of own internal perspectives, that's one trap that human-centered design sort of helps us avoid. And we'll talk about how we do that in a minute. The other one, and Kelsey, if you go to the next slide, is we often design or create programs or services with the idea that humans are rational, and they are not. I think we've all laughed at ourselves for doing things that just don't make sense. I think this picture I've seen on the internet a lot. It's just kind of a funny observation that, taking the stairs would probably help support your fitness. But we often go on autopilot. So human decision making, the way that we act, the way that we navigate our day, it's really complex, and a lot of it's based on sort of millennia of our biological wiring, and frankly, a lot of it just doesn't make any sense sort of in our modern world. And as much as we'd like to think about ourselves as being rational beings, in truth, a lot of our behavior is actually ruled by the subconscious. We often react emotionally, or we make decisions on intuition or habit and kind of go on autopilot. And this can actually end up leading us to take actions that go against our interests, so are not rational for us, but we do them anyway. And so as educational professionals, we already are seeking to sort of be agents of change in a lot of ways. And we all know that change is really hard, as it is. And so when we fail to account for these sort of natural human tendencies that are just part of the everyday experience of being a person, we're really making our jobs sort of that much harder. And so design thinking and human-centered design are frameworks and sort of disciplines of knowledge that kind of help us overcome those problems. Kelsey, do you mind hitting the next slide? And so what we're going to do next, and I'm going to turn this over to Kelsey, is we're going to dig into, like I said, sort of one framework within human-centered design, which is called design thinking. It's a very defined process that you can work through. And Kelsey's going to give you an introduction to that, and then we're going to help you guys work through some examples of your own. So Kelsey, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. So, yeah, the design thinking process was first formalized by Idea, which is an international design firm. Since then, it's really been expanded upon and studied by research and design practitioners from all over the world. So, in this section, like Jess said, we're really going to dig into how to use it. So, first, we kind of need to take a look at the process. So it's comprised of 5 basic stages, which is empathy, problem definition, ideating or solutioning, kind of can be referred to as both prototyping and testing. And then although that these are often kind of presented in a linear fashion, kind of like you can see it here, they're really not. Like we find ourselves jumping back and forth between the stages a lot. In particular, the empathizing and defining is really a back and forth process, as are ideating, prototyping, and testing. So this framework is also really designed to encourage divergent and convergent thinking, and it's a sort of zooming in and zooming out process. So we're going to start with step 1, which is the empathizing. And this is really all about getting started with kind of a beginner's mindset, and really understanding the needs and motivation of the audience that you are designing for. So this is one of the zoom out stages, and it starts with really eliminating or questioning your own ideas and assumptions about what the problem really is. So it's a chance to say, like, is the problem really what I think it is? Or how can we walk a mile in the audience's shoes and really better understand their perspective? Or like, have we worked through the process ourselves? So this last one is really important, but it's frequently overlooked. So it's often colloquially and really kind of grossly referred to as eating your own dog food. So like, have we done the thing that we're asking our audiences to do? And if we've done it, what do we think about it? And how do we feel about it? So then, so once we have a good understanding of the audience's needs, their motivations, their perspectives, we can really take a look at what we've learned and define the problem that needs solved. So the problem definition stage is all about zooming back in and kind of getting to the heart of the issue. So there are lots of ways that you can do this, but one that we kind of recommend is just listing out all your observations separately and very specifically. So you might want to write them down, put them on note cards, or Post-it notes, stick them on a table, stick them on a wall, just so that you can really see what you're working with. And then you kind of can have some patterns or pain points or tipping points that sort of emerge when you have it all laid out in front of you. So take a look at like what keeps coming up again and again, and then see if you can kind of sort those thoughts into different categories. So kind of look for the most annoying or detrimental problem that your audience is facing. So like the problem that if it's solved could create kind of a domino effect, and cause everything else to sort of just fall into place. Once you've identified a few of those problems that you might want to tackle, you need to work on framing them. So it's one thing to state the problem generally, but it's another to really get specific about the context and the core of the issue. So that takes us to the next step, which is the ideation stage, where we really need to zoom back out and return kind of to our divergent thinking. So the goal here is really to develop as many ideas as possible and really encourage as much diversity in our thinking as we can. So while we're really staying focused on the problem at hand and working within the parameters of our design brief. So here at this point, like, we're not looking for polished ideas with every detail accounted for. This is not the time for perfection. So the designer, Art Sandoval, kind of described the goals in this stage pretty well when he said, now the goal is to give you a mass quantity of ideas quickly, not solutions, but the seeds to possible solutions. So in short, really it is quantity, not quality. We'll sort out the best, most viable ideas at a later stage. And then that takes us to step 4, which is prototyping. So once you've identified a couple of your options to test, it's time to create a prototype so that they can actually be tested. One mistake that people sometimes make when it comes to prototyping is they go for like super high fidelity prototypes right away, or things that are going to be very close to how you envision as your kind of end result. So instead, you really want to try to find ways to get back to the heart of the matter. You want to communicate and test really only the experiences or features that are kind of the most novel and the aspects of the solution that you most kind of need to get evaluation or feedback from. From there, you want to develop an MVP. So in this instance, it's your minimum viable product. So in this context, it would be like the absolute simplest way that you can convey your experience to those testing or responding to it. So in a lot of instances, this is just like a sketch or an outline. In some others, you might need to create a mock-up or a simulation, but really an important thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't have to like really work at this stage. It just has to kind of provide the illusion of working well enough so that you can really get meaningful feedback. Okay. And then that takes us to step 5, which is testing. So once you've developed the prototype or the pilot, you got to see if it works. So as educational professionals, most of you, I'm sure, are really familiar with the basics of like research and evaluation. So those same rules apply here when you're testing out your prototypes. And if you're developing like interview or survey questions, it's really important to like stay neutral and kind of not lead or frame the test or subject responses. Like you really don't want to accidentally encourage or discourage certain types of feedback with your reaction. So a poker face is good here if you can do it. But you also want to be sure to not give any more instructions than are absolutely necessary. You can also often learn a whole lot by the aspects of your solution that really confuse people. And then finally, it's super important to give your testers a way to provide you with constructive feedback. And then Jess, I'm gonna send it back to you.
So if we have any sort of science educators in the room today, you guys might feel like this is sort of another variation of the scientific process, and that would be spot on. You know, really understanding the environment with the empathizing stage, developing sort of a hypothesis whenever you're in that definition piece, coming up with potential solutions to build out and then test and then iterate on. And so this is sort of our design way of applying that scientific method to the way that we address problems. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more in depth, because I know that was a quick overview. Here later in the presentation, Brianna is going to walk you through some examples. But before we get into that, I did want to note that there is a lot of psychology behind this as well. So if you are sort of a student of design thinking and human-centered design, there are a lot of what we call sort of natural human biases or cognitive biases or shortcuts or heuristics that we take into consideration as we are developing solutions and understanding the issues at hand. And so I wanted to go over a few of those concepts with you all. And this is just a very short list. You know, there's a lot more to dig into and learn, but some that I think are particularly relevant for the education realm. And then talk about ways that we might be able to use some of those concepts as we think about solutions for our students and families and communities. So like I said, human-centered design and design thinking really focus on working within the reality of how humans decide instead of some ideal version of how they should. And so here are some things that are really helpful to know. Kelsey, if you can go to the next slide. One bias that almost all of us have is a tendency to focus more on the negative than the positive. So for example, have you ever had like a glowing performance review at work, but found yourself returning just repeatedly to the one point of criticism that your boss offered? Or have you ever made the decision not to purchase a product with like a 4.9 out of 5 rating and like 10,000 reviews, just because you saw like one particularly nasty negative review? And that's the negativity bias at work. And so these two posters really cracked me up. They were created by an artist who found sort of our natural tendency to focus on the negative really kind of funny. And she created this series, the Subpar Parks series, which illustrates 1-star reviews that people have left on TripAdvisor after visiting national parks. And it's so funny to think about, like, you know, you're in this sort of place that is just absolutely glorious, so beautiful, you know, surrounded by the awesomeness of nature. And then, you know, somebody's looking and being like, there are too many rocks, or, you know, the trees are blocking my view. And it's funny, but I mean, it's how most of us operate, even though we're kind of making fun of these folks. Like, we do focus on the negative way more than the positive. And in fact, psychologists who have studied relationships and sort of interpersonal communication have found that we are far more affected by negative stimuli and give more weight to negative feedback or criticism, maybe as much as 10 times more than the positive. So they've estimated that it takes between 6 and 10 positives or positive experiences or positive ideas to offset one negative that we've been exposed to. And so I can give you guys like a real life example of this. So, and Heather will know this. She's the amazing counselor that I'm going to refer to here. But I don't think I will ever forget the day that we were working together in our curate program, and this student reached out to us in tears. So it was the first day of the fall semester at WVU, at West Virginia University. And we had this text messaging program that allowed us to send sort of personalized text messages out to students. And so on the first day of classes for WVU, we sent out text messages to any student in our system that we knew was going to WVU, and just said, hey, like, good luck today. Hope everything's going well. Let us know if you have any problems or questions, and you know, call us or text us if you need anything. And within just a few minutes, Heather had gotten this message back with this student. She was just in absolute anguish, and she was just she was saying she was going to drop out, that she couldn't do this, you know, that basically she was in over her head. And Heather recognized that this girl was, you know, really deeply in distress, and asked if it would be okay to actually just call her on her cell phone. And so she said yes, and Heather did. And as it turns out, like, the girl was upset because she didn't understand the parking system at WVU. So she had come from like a really small rural town, hadn't really driven in larger cities much, and was just totally freaked out because she didn't know where to park. And so, like, imagine that like this girl was going to drop out of college and like completely derail her future, the future she had planned for herself, because of parking. So, like, fortunately, Heather calmed her down. She connected this girl to a really wonderful staff member at WVU who set aside time in her day that day to meet with this student one-on-one and help her kind of like get a handle on the ropes of you know, navigating the campus. And the girl stayed in school. But you know, it was just really telling to me that just this one, what we think of as maybe seemingly small negative experience, was enough to, like I said, completely change the trajectory of the student's plans in life. And so it kind of illustrates the importance of really going above and beyond to offset any sort of negative experience. So not just saying like, oh, okay, we helped you figure out parking, but taking the time to give her personalized support and make sure she's okay, and walk her maybe through, like, here's a tour of campus, because it takes that many more positive experiences to kind of alleviate the problems of that one negative. Kelsey, can you go to the next slide? So another tendency that we have as people, and something to keep in mind, is that we are really reactive to a sense of urgency or scarcity. And so if we perceive something to be limited, our primal instincts really kick in, and then we're just biologically wired from, our days as, scavenging in the forest to compete for resources. And so one way to kind of design programs or capture attention or get people to act is to present something as being scarce or limited. And so this is an example that the College Foundation of West Virginia put together. And what they did was they used scarcity to sort of draw students' attention to what they called their Cash for College campaign. And so they created flyers for financial aid workshops that looked similar to $10 bills, with obviously enough variance to avoid like charges of counterfeiting. And then counselors, high school counselors in the schools, crumpled these flyers up and dropped them near vending machines and lockers and other places, other high traffic areas. And so from afar, it just looked like money, crumpled money lying in the floor. And so students would mistake these flyers for this drop money, and they would rush to grab it before anyone else saw it. We've all had that experience of seeing money lying around. You're like, oh man, like I'm gonna like cross the street and dive for that before somebody else gets it. And so they would go for this money, and then like they pick it up and realize, oh, this isn't money at all. And they'd kind of unfurl it and see what they actually picked up. And it was a flyer on the back that told them about an upcoming financial aid workshop and how they could find money for college. And it got the message across. And, as a bonus, what was really cool was that a lot of these students would then just like kind of laugh and crumple it up and drop it on the floor again and kind of perpetuate the cycle. But that's a really good example of sort of this idea of urgency or scarcity, like making people act in the moment at play. Kelsey, can you do the next slide? Another thing that is surprisingly powerful is the way that personalization can make a big impact when we're designing things. So again, if we think about like the day-to-day life that we all experience, we're bombarded with ads and messages and notifications and emails and a million other things. And so to be able to handle all that, because we just can't process that volume of information, we've really just learned to sort of tune it out and to regard 99.9% of the stimuli that are coming toward us as being not for us or not relevant to us. And so one way that we can really use design and design principles to capture people's attention and get them to act is just to do something as simple as making it personalized. And so basically by saying like, yes, we definitely mean you, this message is for you, we can often break through that sort of noise. And so again, this is an example from that text messaging program that I'd mentioned earlier. And one thing that we noticed when we were creating that is that a lot of students have become very skeptical of any sort of electronic communication. So they just assume that it's automated, that it's a bot, that it's not a real person. Even if we would say, we're a real person, they would be like, yeah, right. And so what we started doing was like incorporating information that made it clear that we knew who they were, right? So we had worked with these students in these schools for a long time. We had profiles on them. And so we would say like, hey, Kelsey, there's an upcoming financial aid workshop at Riverside High School on Tuesday. Let us know if you're registered, if you have any questions. And so that level of personalization would kind of signal to them that like we really knew who they were and that we really cared and would help them. And then we could provide this really personalized support, because a lot of times students would reach back out. Like for example, on this one, students said, I couldn't make it to the last financial aid workshop. I need my FAFSA done. And so we were able to look and say, oh, actually there's another FAFSA workshop coming up at your school, and kind of build those relationships. But even if you don't have the resources to provide sort of this level of personalization, you can still make an impact just with some really simple customization. So for example, in mass marketing emails, even ones that incorporate just the slightest customization of starting the email with like, hi, Kelsey, or hi, Jess. So all you really have to know is the person's first name, and then you can kind of drop in that variable field. Those emails are opened at a far higher rate than those that don't have any element of personalization. And so just calling students by name or parents by name can have a huge impact in whether or not they act and take notice of your messaging. Next slide, Kelsey. The next one that I'll talk about is sort of this, it goes back to this urgency idea. And so we utilize something that we call sort of just-in-time reminders, right? So finding that sweet spot between the point where students can act and have the urgency to act. So this goes a little bit counter to some of the things that we think about as counselors and educators. So for example, when I was working with the Gear Up program, one of the things that I noticed was that a lot of our schools would try to help students and families sort of stay organized in planning for college. And they would provide these annual planning calendars and to-do lists to help families stay on track. And we would provide them too through our guides. And that's a really great practice. And it can help sort of provide a framework and sort of prime students and families to know what action they're going to be expected to take throughout the year. But I think sometimes we undertook that process with the wrong goal in mind. So we were thinking like, you know, I'm giving you this in advance. I'm giving you months to plan for it. Like, you know, I told you about this months ago, you better have this done by October or whatever. And in fact, that's not really the best way to think about this, because we're actually giving people too much time to actually take action if we're telling them months and months in advance or before they're able to act. And so just-in-time reminders rely on, okay, we are going to tell you when it's time to do this at a period in time where you're able to take action on it and at a point in time where you're not likely to delay. So like it's urgent for you right now. And so you don't want to wait, for example, if you're trying to remind students to apply for like a financial aid deadline, like to like an hour before it's due, like that's not enough time to act. But if you send a message saying, hey, the application for the Promise Scholarship is due in 3 days, you need to get this in now. What we saw when we send those level of reminders is that people would act much more quickly, or, you know, registering for the ACT, the deadline for the February test is, you know, tomorrow, you need to sign up tonight. We would see students take action a lot quicker because if they had time to forget, they often wouldn't do it. Next slide. And then this one's kind of similar in a way in that it's a little bit counterintuitive to some of the things that we might think about as counselors. But we often tend to think of like having choices as being very liberating and positive. But it's also one of the most common ways for humans to become overwhelmed. And when we become overwhelmed, we tend to just shut down and do absolutely nothing at all. So there's this famous study where psychologists Iyengar and Lepper, they placed cameras in a grocery store aisle where they had set up this display of like artisanal jams. And so in one test, they placed dozens and dozens of flavors for consumers to choose from. And then they observed what happened. And so what they saw was that people seemed really intrigued by the choices, and they spent a lot of time looking at them and at the various options, but very few of them actually made a purchase. And so in the second test, they put out just 6 flavors of jam, and sales absolutely skyrocketed. And so we might say, okay, yeah, but what do condiment sales have to do with like education and access to college and higher education? But I think it speaks to the fact that like one of our natural tendencies when we're counseling students is to let them know that there are a wide variety of options, right? Everything from certificate programs to apprenticeships to military service to 2-year, 4-year programs, and how many degree programs and institutions are there available within those realms. And so we think like, if we just make them aware of all of the opportunities, like surely they'll find something that is a good fit for them. But if we're not careful, we can really be working against ourselves when we do that, because we could be overwhelming them and basically making them choose nothing because they can't figure out what to choose. And so one thing to keep in mind as you're sort of designing your programs, your interventions, your communication, is to not only provide students with choices, but give them very clear ways and processes for navigating those choices and narrowing down their list. Next slide. And the final sort of psychological principle that I'll talk about today, before we move into sort of how to apply some of these ideas from both design thinking and sort of design psychology, is this sense of identity, right? So This is a really powerful lever, I think. And I think a lot of us probably in this room would have recognized this, right? We try to demonstrate sort of social norms. You know, lots of people go to college. We share success stories, you know, of other students like you succeeding. And, you know, those of us who have studied these sorts of things, we understand that like identity and self-development are really complex subjects, but our solutions don't necessarily have to be complex to make a difference, if that makes sense. So one thing that people sort of have an innate need to do is to be consistent with what they've said they're going to do. And I know this is something that probably a lot of us have lamented, that, you know, people say they're going to do something and they don't. And you know, we focus on that. But by and large, you know, again, it's that negativity bias at work. By and large, people tend to do what they say they're going to do. And because there's this cognitive dissonance if they don't, and it really sort of bothers them. And so we can kind of help sort of students to think about being, you know, I'm college bound, or, you know, I'm a straight A student, or I'm a excellent student. And if we can help them sort of assume that identity, their actions tend to follow. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is like, it's important to have students buy into this idea, of course, but sometimes we can nudge them in that direction. So for example, there's this really fascinating study, or fascinating to me, where these psychologists, and I honestly don't know how they got away with this. This seems very unethical to me, but they did it. So they published these fake findings in a newspaper in a couple of towns back in like the mid 20th century, where they told the people in these towns that there had been this research study, and they found that the citizens in these, you know, suburbs were far more generous than people in other areas. And so they published these findings in the newspaper. They were totally bogus. And then 6 months later, they went back and they had people soliciting door to door, asking for donations to charities. And then they had similar requests made in towns where these bogus findings hadn't been published. And what they found is that the people in the towns who had seen these articles were significantly, substantially far more likely to make donations to charities, because they had sort of assumed that identity that had been assigned to them, and they wanted to live up to it. And so I think it's really fascinating, and it kind of gives us a solid reasoning behind doing things like giving students t-shirts that say college bound, or even just referring to students as being good students, or you know, on a college bound path. And I think it also reinforces what a lot of us know in working with students, is that students tend to rise to the bar that we set for them. And we can kind of nudge them in the right direction just by helping them see themselves as having this potential. So I will wrap up sort of the psychology piece there, and I'm going to turn it over to Brianna, who is going to kind of walk you through some real life examples to sort of apply design thinking and some of these psychological principles sort of in action. So.
Hi, thanks, Jess. So we've kind of gone over the 5 steps to design thinking and some of the tools and tactics that you can use to implement the process. So to see maybe how you would go about doing it with an example, we're going to go over it together with a simple example and kind of have you follow along. And we don't have a lot of time, so you're not going to have as much time to like brainstorm and come up with some great solution to a wicked problem, probably, but maybe in the next 15 minutes. But for this purpose, Kelsey, if you want to go to the next slide. I taught for 10 years before this, and so I was trying to come up with something that would be fairly relatable to everyone. And I think community involvement is always a big issue. And so one thing that we always did was have like open houses to the beginning of the year to try to get parents and students to come, and it was always not a huge attendance level. So that was one I thought would be a good idea to kind of go over, maybe applying this step. I mean, and even it was hard for me to even want to go. So I can understand why sometimes parents and teachers might not, or students might not want to come. So Kelsey, if you want to get the next slide. So first, before we dive into it for this example, If you have a piece of paper or whatever, just give you a minute here to jot down maybe a problem that just instantly comes to mind. Maybe you've already, been thinking about it, or it could just be something super simple, just so you can kind of follow along to get the idea of how you might apply it here. And feel free to add your idea to the chat room. If you, think you have a great idea, or maybe someone else might see it and be like, hey, yeah, I've, done that. Here's a great solution to it. Kelsey, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. And if you didn't have an idea, it might come to you as we're working through this one. Something might pop into you as we're going. So the first step in that 5-step process is to empathize. So in this way, one good way to start this is to just kind of do some research and ask those who have had similar experiences. So for this case, I might ask like other fellow teachers, friends who are parents, like, hey, you've been invited to open house events. Why have you not wanted to go to it? Or if you did go to it, what was some of the positive things that came from going to it? But you want to put yourself in, try to, empathize with that person that you are relating to, and ask some questions like, why would this parent or student not want to participate in this event? Imagine maybe being a first generation parent and being really nervous about just going, as adults, we have anxiety about going to new places, as much as your child does. Or maybe you had a bad experience in school, and so just the thought of going back to a school just sounds terrible. So just, start off writing all of these just brainstorming ideas down. And this is where you're going to create this persona or profile of the person that you are trying to relate to. Kelsey, next slide, please. So this would kind of give you an idea of like what the empathizing process might look like. Just some quick ideas that might come to mind. Like maybe, like I said, both parents and students are intimidated of like the school and the staff. It's that idea of somewhere new, places you've never been to, people you don't know. I still get like that. Maybe the big one that comes to mind is you just don't have enough time. Like who has enough time to do anything? So why do I want to, go up here and spend my time when they got to go to school anyways? What's it going to do? It's just that idea of, once again, the anxiety and feeling uncomfortable with a bunch of people you don't know. Maybe a positive thing would be that, hey, it's a great time to see all your new classes. You've never been here before, so this way you're not lost that first day of school. Or you get to meet your teachers. You get to kind of create that rapport with them if you play sports, if you're in band. Just something to kind of get you in and get you knowing that person before you meet them on the first day with, 30 other kids at the same time. Next slide. So if you did have a time, or maybe you came up with one while we're doing it, I'll give you another 30 seconds or a minute. Just write down, think of the first person that your problem might affect. Is it the student? Is it a parent? Is it teachers, or whatever? And just write down like, a quick 1 or 2 sentences or statements that you feel that person can relate to. And like I said, this is a process that definitely takes some time if you're really wanting to work through it. You can't do it in just a minute, but just for experience sake, we'll go through it quickly. Next slide. So now that we've empathized, brainstormed, you want to define that problem. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to use the tool who, what, and why. Next slide. The famous inventor Charles Kettering once said that a problem well stated is half solved. So to make sure before you get started that you have your problem clearly articulated, You can answer the questions to this simple formula. I want, and this is who we want to act. Then what we want them to do would be step 2. And 3 is why do we want them to do it? So for this case, I want parents and students to attend the start of the year open house event so that all parties, teachers included, are more comfortable and they feel more positive about their school year, which, like we've talked about, that feeling of positivity will lead to other things. That's going to hopefully lead to higher achievement and success. Later on down the road, if they're having an issue with a homework assignment, they would have felt nervous and didn't want to ask their teacher for help because they haven't really got to know them that well. But maybe if they came to that open house event and they had a one-on-one with that teacher, they might feel more comfortable to go up to them and ask for help. So next slide. If you want to just take a minute to try to fill in the who, what, why. And then next slide. The next step would be to ideate. So in this step, we take a look at our definition and kind of reshape it by asking questions that are going to help us look for the solutions, such as how might we encourage students and their guardians to attend an open house? So you might grab a notebook, start jotting down different thoughts or ideas, and then take a moment to read through a few of the examples from your brainstorming. And notice that, everything you write down is not going to be a solution. It might be additional questions like, well, in this case, what do I do here? Or what would be this? And so you don't have to have completely fleshed out ideas. You just need to have those seeds of an idea to get you going. Next slide. So in this case, like a few examples that I might jot down to this problem would be, first off, make it simple and easy to participate. If people are worried about time, then, if they know they can get in and out of there fairly quickly, that would be great. Provide an incentive. Everybody loves getting free stuff or free food. I know that was always, we would have so much food and that would be a huge thing. It'd be gone by the time it was over. And it didn't have to be fancy food either. And that's for teachers too. If you've ever been to a teacher's lounge, you know that food is gone. Like I had second lunch and I would miss out on so many free cookies and cakes. But fear of missing out, if you provide something that's only available that night, then they have to come that night. So that's always a good one. Make sure you advertise the event. We forget about things we don't know, or we might see it once. But if you don't see it kind of frequently, then it's probably not going to stick in your head. And then like a question that you might come to would be like, okay, so what if they say they're going to go, but then how do you keep them from canceling or changing their mind at the last minute? Because we all know that, when you first commit to something, oh yeah, I'll be there Friday. And then Friday comes and you're like, oh, I'm tired. I don't want to go. And how can I get out of this? But like, maybe, how can you keep that from happening? Next. I'm sorry if you hear my dog coughing. He's got chronic bronchitis, so excuse him. So some tools and tactics that we talked about some of them before. You might hear a few new ones in this next few slides. But next slide. Couple of them that we might look at. One of them is urgency and scarcity. So like we said, special offers that they don't want to miss out. They're only available if they attend. Like an example would be, that if you bring your child there, they get that one free homework pass. So, and way students don't do homework anyways, that probably wouldn't help a lot. But you could come up with something that might get them to come. And, if it was for the student, they'd be like, Mom, you have to take me because I gotta, whatever it was. Maybe they get to go offer a trip. I know sometimes our school offered like group activities if they would participate in certain things. Next slide. Increasing familiarity, guided tours and experiences for those new students. I think that is a great one. I know a lot of people, like I said, are always nervous about doing something new. So if you can find a way to make it less intimidating before they do the big thing with a bunch of other people, then that's always a great possibility. Next slide, please. Social proof. That might be, photos of students and crowds from previous years that you use in some of these advertising, and, choose photos of, people having fun and doing things and making it look like something you might not want to miss out on. Next slide. Just-in-time reminders. Have multiple reminders of the event by multiple methods of communication. You can't just send a flyer home because most likely little Johnny's not going to give that to his mom. So, send a flyer home, send emails, send out calls, send out, whatever ways you can think of. Do multiple methods multiple times to make sure they get that in their head. Next slide. Overcoming unpleasantness. So sometimes if something's unpleasant, but you have that chance of something, that will overcome that, like pizza, or maybe you're offering raffles to win certain prizes. Or I know one of the ideas that went really well at our school was our photography class would have a family photo booth. And so they could get their picture taken with their family. They would actually print it out right there and give it to them. And everybody seemed to really like that because a lot of times, a lot of these people didn't have an opportunity to get photos. So face painting, a lot, you bring your little sisters because they have to come along too. There's no babysitting. Have the little, other people, depending on what age. And I worked in high school, so that was something. But, just find things that might get them to come that would overcome that unpleasantness. Next slide. Overcoming planning. Break up the parent and teacher meetings into small groups and offer a sign up for short time frames. This would be like I said, sometimes you're like, oh, I might get stuck there talking to someone. I don't have enough time for that. But maybe if you offered do you want to sign up for this 15-minute slot here? You'd be in and out in 15 minutes. And it'd be small groups. So that might be an incentive for some of those people that might be, avoiding it for time purposes. Next slide. And then, so after you come up with those ideas, now you need to prototype. So you want to find something that you can measure and show impact because, everybody likes to see those metrics. So start by choosing just one solution to test in the beginning. Don't go overboard. And in this case, we're going to use that just-in-time reminders, but we're also going to add an element of personalization to it. So by putting yourself in your audience's shoes, so in this case, maybe the parents who they were wondering what was the point of attending. I'm not really needed. By using this method, maybe it could make them feel like they were needed. So you could try maybe text messaging the parents. And text messaging is already used a lot. So one way to kind of step it up a notch would be use a personalized message that kind of makes it sound like it's actually from the teacher. So you could say, hey, I really hope to see you here tonight. That way, not only are you reminding them, but you also are giving them that personalization that might bring them and feel like, oh, I have to go because they really want to see me. Even if they are like, yeah, this is a mass message, it has that little bit more personalized sense to it than otherwise just here's the time and date. So we don't really have a lot of time here. You can do that later. We kind of threw that in if there was time. Next slide. So lastly would be to test. So in this case, you want to keep records, and we might keep records of the attendance. That way you can compare it to the future events. but also compare the attendance between different, like I said, we started off with sending these messages to one homeroom for each grade. So compare, what was the percentage of that homeroom versus the ones that did not get the message? Was it higher? And that might not be a necessarily fact that was the reason why, but if it was, especially over all the grades, then that might give you a good reason to try it again, but use more homerooms and more parents to get it the next time. And you can also try doing like a follow-up survey, maybe to those who did get the text message and ask them, like, did this help? Or, and in this case, a follow-up survey might not be an option, but a lot of times follow-up surveys or questionnaires are great ways to get feedback from people about your prototype and your test. So that was kind of a very quick run through of an example, but kind of see how it might be that 5-step process might be used to apply to a problem that you have in whatever area. And if anyone, wants to share their problem or anything in the chat or polls, you can, feel free to comment or add. Or if you have any questions, we got about 5 minutes if you want to post. And I will pass it back over to end it with Jess.
So thank you all, and thank you for your time today. And I know this is a very quick introduction to a process that a lot of folks study and practice, but I hope it kind of gives you a framework for thinking through the problems that you might face every day. And kind of, I think sometimes half the battle is just figuring out a way to break down your thoughts. And so this is one that we use a lot, and then we try to use some of these psychology principles to help us brainstorm ideas and solutions and things that might be impacting the sort of behavior of the folks we're working with. And that's maybe the one takeaway I would give you all is it's definitely a jumping off point and a starting point to come up with new ideas and thoughts as you work through things. And there's not really a right or wrong way to do it. It's just a tool like anything else. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Heather. I don't know if we have any questions or any sort of wrap up task that we need to accomplish.
Well, first of all, thank you all very, very much for presenting. I find it all very fascinating and interesting. There are a couple of questions. First and foremost, folks are asking if they can get a copy of your slides. Are you cool with that? Okay, so everybody, I'll make sure that we get a copy of the slides and we'll get those posted and uploaded along with a recording of the sessions to our CFWB Connect site, specifically our Student Success Summit landing page. And we'll be sure to send an email out to all of our participants with that landing page and information for any of our downloadable resources and also copies of the presentation, which I'm super excited and have loved listening to all of this. I personally have one question as a former educator, and I know that I know Bree is, and I know that Kelsey and Jess are a little bit familiar with this. One of the big buzzwords and topics in education over the last 15 years was problem-based learning. Kids learn best by building blocks and not physical building blocks, but taking information and building and scaffolding information, but also taking a problem, finding a solution, and having personal investment into it. My question is design thinking, is it a huge leap from problem-based learning to design thinking? Are they in the same family? Because the little bit of research that I'd done prior to your all's presentation, like, this sounds somewhat familiar. It's not foreign to me. I think it maybe just goes a little bit above and beyond, but also I think it's part of that the next generation, because technology gets involved as well. So before I answer my own question with my own thought process, I want to turn it over to you guys because you're kind of the experts. Is my train of thought correct here?
I definitely think it is. It's like you said, it might be taking it just another step, or especially because in our case, we're dealing with companies and stuff, but it's that same, using problem solving is supposed to help you versus just that multiple choice question answer. It doesn't provide the same thought process as, you know, actually giving them one big problem and using all the information in that problem to solve it. And so, yeah, it's a lot of the same steps, just maybe worded differently.
Oh, great. I'm glad I was on the right train of thought with that for sure, to help kind of make that connection too with some of our educators. Lots of great points. Well, with that, ladies, I appreciate you. We are right at the 11 o'clock hour. For our participants, please feel free in the next 15 minutes or so to go and visit the expo. We've got lots of great spotlight videos there and some people live and in person to talk to you about their organizations. And the next sessions then start at 11:30. Ladies, I appreciate you being here. I hope you stick around to check out some of the other sessions, but I know that your lives are just as busy. Jess just put up a great article there in the chats. This particular session booth will shut down here in the next 5 minutes, and the next group of sessions will pop up at 11:25 for you guys to pop into. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.